This is Dr. Jacqueline Duget, and you're listening to What is Black podcast, where we have conversations about raising African American children and the intersection of race, culture, and identity.
Good morning. I'd like to welcome our special guest, Dr. Janie Ward. She is a professor at Simmons College. So good morning, Dr. Ward.
Yes, good morning. How are you today?
I'm doing very well. I didn't do justice to your title, so I was wondering if you can share a little bit more about your professional background for our listeners.
Sure. Currently, I am a professor at Simmons University in Boston, Massachusetts, where I chair two different departments, the Department of Africana Studies as well as the Education Department. And my background is as a developmental psychologist who does educational research. So I focus primarily on Black kids in elementary and secondary school, as well as in college. And I'm particularly interested in racial identity, moral identity, and gender identity.
That sounds wonderful. Dr. Ward, I first learned about your work while I was doing research for an article that a colleague of mine, Dr. Shanta Anderson, and I wrote for the AAP, and it really came out of, unfortunately, report after report of the deaths of African Americans at the hands of police, unfortunately, and other instances. So just the rising talk about violence and the African American or perpetrated against African Americans. And also to the growing discussion about race and racism. Not that that's ever gone away, but I think it became more evident over the last couple of years, or more prevalent,
for sure,
over the last couple of years. And so it got me to think about, how do we have, quote unquote, the talk with our kids, right? How do we help prepare them and empower them to address some of these difficult conversations, these difficult issues, and also, like you said, kind of still feel good about themselves despite some of the negative messages that they're hearing. So I wanted to, I guess, first have you explain, you're a little bit more expert than I am, on what is the talk?
Sure. So, when I first started my research, when I was just a graduate student back in the 1980s, I would talk to adolescents, Black adolescents, and eventually started talking to parents themselves. And what the kids would do is, of course, they'd talk about the kinds of conversations that they have with their parents and the topic of those conversations. At that time, I would say that a lot of there were some gender differences. So a lot of what the girls would talk about would be, I talked to my mom about girl things. And for young Black women, that often circled back to feeling good about yourself, feeling attractive, feeling worthy, because there are so many messages out there that are aimed at Black women that devalue the way that we look or the way that we are in the world. So those are the kinds of things that Black girls would say they would talk to their moms about. Black boys, on the other hand, often talked about their parents would alert them to the hyper surveillance that of the police in neighborhoods, how careful you have to be when you're out in public spaces, how to behave in front of police. So that's been going on for decades. But back when I started, it tended to be more gendered, right? It was more for the boys. I would say that the talk today, the talk being defined as what do we say to our children to help to prepare them for the socio-political world that they live in. I would say that the talk today is less gendered in the sense that we talk to girls as well about public spaces. We talk to girls as well about police surveillance and the criminal justice system eating them up because it is a fact, right? There are books and reports and TV shows and movies all focusing on how difficult it can be for young African Americans and other brown-skinned people in this world today. It just feels as though so much is stacked against us in our schools, in our communities, sometimes even in our homes. And so that's what the talk is all about. It's preparing our kids for the reality that they live in.
Now, when we talked, when I first had an opportunity to speak with you, we talked about there's probably also some differences based on socioeconomic as well as developmental. And I was wondering if you could speak to those influences on how the talk may how those attributes or characteristics may infuse or provide some additional context for those conversations.
Yeah, sure. So, the buzzword these days is intersectionality. And all that means is that we can't walk around with this notion that all black people are the same and that their experiences are the same, because that is just not the case. There are some of us who have more money than others of us. There are some of us who live in predominantly black communities. Others of us live in predominantly white communities. And depending on where we live, what kinds of resources exist in the family, our experiences with race can be quite different. And so when we talk about the talk, we need to be able to break down for our kids conversations about who you are and how to navigate the world that you're in that is tied to the context that the child is growing up in. So when kids are in predominantly black spaces, there are certain advantages associated with that. Perhaps you are surrounded by people who look like you, people who, not only are you being raised by your mama, but you might also be raised by other black women who look like you, who share similar cultural values, and you might be, really raised in a community. Whereas if you're in a predominantly white setting, things might be different. You may not see as many black people in a given day, given week. You may not see black folks until the holidays when your family gets together, or maybe if you continue to go to a black church, Mm-hmm. So how we shape those messages can differ significantly based on the context, socioeconomic context of our lives. The other thing that's really important has to do with development, and that is that we always have to be cognizant of the fact that how we shape our messages to children need to take into account the age of the child and the developmental capacity of the child. So there are certain things that you can say to teenagers that you wouldn't necessarily say to a 7-year-old, right? Mm-hmm. You don't want to scare children. It's always a balancing act, because what we want to do as black folks is talk to our children about the fact that they could become victimized in a society that devalues you based on the color of your skin. At the same time, we do not want our children to grow up with a victim mentality. Mm-hmm. We don't want them to walk around thinking, oh, everybody's against me and there's nothing I can do, and so why try? So it's a balancing act between orienting them to the reality of the world, but also giving them the tools to be able to navigate the hard times and thrive and become the kind of person that they want to be and we want them to be. So how you do that takes time. You start when they're young. The messages that we give to children when they're young may focus more on the self, talking about how beautiful they are, talking about how smart they are. And they will get even smarter yet when they're in school and they're reading and learning about Black people and the struggles that we've had and the ways that we've overcome, giving them those tools, building up their self-esteem. When they get to adolescence and they're out in the world, and we parents are not with them all the time, and they have to make decisions about who they're going to hang around with, what they're going to do with their lives, the kinds of conversations we have with them about being Black and male or female or gay or trans or whatever they are is really going to be different, be more focused, and really, and it has to be delivered in a way that teenagers will listen to it.
So it sounds like the heart of the talk really is the talk, is having those conversations, which I think is, it's kind of like, it's like mind blowing in a way. It's like, it's that simple, right? You got to have the conversation. It could still be, it might be a rough conversation at first, or, but at least you're starting to have that conversation. And I think the one thing I loved in the previous conversation we had is the importance of affirming children and how having these conversations does that.
It does that, because it says, I see you, I understand you, and I am, you are my child. And one of the things that is really important to say is that I am talking primarily about parents having conversations with their children, but the talk can be delivered by any adult in a child's life. They don't have to be biologically connected. Many of us can tell stories of having adults in our lives who sat down, talked with us, saw us for who we are, and acknowledged us. And they weren't our parent, right? They might have been the piano teacher. They might have been the minister. They might have been a teacher. So, this is not work that is located only within the parental unit, but it is work that is intergenerational, right? People who have been there and know a little something that's passing on information to the next generation.
So, Dr. Ward, I was wondering, in a previous conversation as well, I mean, we talked about the fact that there are transracial adoptions, or there, multiracial families that are raising kids of color, African ancestry. So I was wondering, what would your suggestions be for parents having those conversations with their kids if it's a transracial adoption? Mom or dad might be of a different race than their children.
Yeah. So one of the things that's been interesting now that the talk has been named, right, and there are a lot of people who are talking about the talk. When I go out and either talk about my book or talk about parenting Black children, folks come up to me, and there's a wide range of really interesting dilemmas that are out there regarding parenting of Black children. And so, for instance, I have been struck by how many people of African descent are raising Black children and are grappling with these questions of race but the parent themselves may not have had a lot of experience with race in America. So now I'm thinking about African immigrant parents, right, who might have been born in Africa, might have been born in the West Indies, or in Caribbean nations, may have been born in Europe, and now they're raising their children in the U.S., where we have a very unique way of doing race. And their children are having all of these experiences with race, but the parents are still trying to make sense of what the heck is going on. So developmentally, there can be kind of a misalignment, a mismatch. And the parents are asking me, what do I say? How do I make sense of this? Okay, that's one group. There are also parents, black parents, who might have been born in this country, for whom dealing with race in their life has been such a difficult journey that now as parents, they don't even know how to talk to their kids without scaring the kids, without, sharing all of their pain. And so they have some healing to do themselves before they can talk to their children in ways that are affirming and will move the child along in positive ways. And then there are white parents who may have a black child. They might be biologically connected to that child. They may have adopted that child. And because their lived experiences being white in America is quite different than being a person of color, they too are struggling with, well, what do I say to my kid? This was not my experience growing up. I don't have messages that I can reflect on that my mama gave to me when I was growing up. I'm starting at stage one. What do I do? What do I say? So I think that, it's really interesting to kind of stand back and think about all of the black kids that are out there and the various needs that kids may have around the talk, right? And there's a role for all of us to play because kids are growing up in so many different contexts.
So I guess it goes back to, to what you said earlier. If it's whether or not the parent has that shared contextual experience with racism, I think just having the conversation, like you said, even, just doing it developmentally, affirming who they are when they're young, exposing them to positive images, and also listening to them and talking with them about struggles that they may be dealing with and you yourself might be dealing with.
Right. I think that one of the things that we've been able to do as a people is that we have shared these messages with one another, right? Mm-hmm. A long time ago, we didn't have psychologists or especially not child psychologists. This idea of counselors and therapists supporting parents, that was not part of what we did as a people, right? We relied on each other. It's time for us to do that now more than ever. As I was talking, I was also thinking that perhaps one of the reasons why the talk is so important now is because parents are really anxious. Our children are on social media a lot. Yes. And our kids are seeing videos of police brutality or of, white folks calling the police on black folks just because they, for whatever reasons, feel unsafe. And our kids need to have some place where they can talk this out, preferably with somebody who can help them to understand and answer their questions and give them the tools to make sense of this in ways that are, affirming and good for the child. And so sitting back and saying, well, hopefully they're going to figure this out on their own, right? Mm-hmm. Or sitting back and thinking, well, I'll get to it when I think he's a little older and can understand it. We don't have time for that anymore, because you don't know what your child is being exposed to in social media, and you don't know how they are going, who they're talking to comprehend what's going on. So the talk is for now. This is the time to do it.
And I think the one thing that continues to resonate with me is that, so, you're as an educator, a developmental psychologist, myself as a pediatrician, we're both moms, right, parents. I think the one thing is that they're like tried and true tools. Like when a patient comes to me and I give anticipatory guidance, unfortunately this isn't the typical anticipatory guidance I give to parents. But we tell our parents, play with your kids, interact with them, spend quality time. This is part of that quality time. It's a different type of quality time. But again, if you're engaging with your kids, reading, I think there are opportunities to read books. You can read affirming books, read books
Absolutely.
And there are opportunities to have conversations. And even with social media,
Absolutely.
I think these are opportunities. What you see on television, right, or the lack of what you might see on television, there might be opportunities, again, developmentally. So what do you think about that? And which I think is so perfect. I think you kind of break it down for like making it tangible. You have to talk. And again, the talk isn't necessarily always, you're sitting down with your kid and say, let's talk about race and racism. It's engaging them.
Right.
So,
right. And sometimes, we have children that if you try to take the direct route, they're out of the door before you can, finish your sentence. They just do not want to talk to you directly about these experiences. But books, and especially for younger readers, there are some amazing books out there that are written for, picture books for elementary age children that explore issues of how you look, appreciating how beautiful you are, that beauty comes in lots of different shapes and sizes and colors. That's a perfect way to start to talk to a child about the importance of self-love and giving kids the tools to be able to psychologically push back when they are bombarded with those messages as they grow older that say that the way that you look does not fit, if you're a girl, the beauty ideal. You don't look as good, right? Now, for young adults, there are really great books that are coming out, some of which are being turned into movies, like The Hate U Give, right?
Oh, that was
so.
I hadn't read the book.
Yeah. So that's a perfect opportunity to talk to a young person, a teenager or a young adult. It's a great story. The movie, was really well made. So sit down with your kid, watch a film together, and talk about the film. It's a perfect entree into this more complicated conversation about race, right? Social media is another place in which there's a lot of chatter. There are some really good blogs that are out there for kids to read. They're short. They are powerfully written. They can jumpstart conversations. And similarly, magazines, especially the magazines that are aimed at Black folks, Essence or Ebony, have had some good articles about race and racism in children. So there are resources out there that we can use to aid us in having the talk. And whether you want to do it visually, whether you want to pick media, whether you want to do print, I don't think it really matters. The idea is to start the conversation, communicate to your child that this is something that's important to me. I hope it's going to be important to you. It is a conversation that's going to go on for quite a long time, right? Mm-hmm. These are issues that we deal with individually across the life cycle, right? It doesn't go away just because you're 40, or you're 60. You're still dealing with being Black and white America. Things are going to change, but, you're still dealing with some of the burdens that are associated with being devalued based on the color of your skin. So we're in this together. Let's talk about how to build each other, support each other, and love each other through this journey.
We talked about books. I thought that was a great transition, because I really love your book, The Skin We're In. And
thank you.
And you're very welcome. You talk about a 4-step model to help parents and teenagers learn to resist racism. Read it, name it, oppose it, replace it. And people can, if they get the book, and I'll definitely put a link to the book in the podcast notes, but I think you do a great job of kind of really outlining what the model entails, how parents can utilize the model, and you also give examples. But I was just wondering, how did you come up with that model and those suggestions to help parents?
So the way that I came up with the model was by listening to parents and listening to teenagers talk about conversations that they've had. So I'll go through really quickly 4 steps. The first step is read it. So what I found is that kids would talk about, something happened at school, for instance, and they're not exactly certain if this thing is racism or, what was going on. They just feel kind of uncomfortable about the situation. I call it read it because I think that sometimes kids need assistance from adults in helping them to figure out what just happened. So how do you read a situation? A teacher might have said something. What should you be listening for? What are the kinds of patterns that occur? Maybe the teacher only said this one time, in which case the way you think it through might be very different. If you feel like, this teacher keeps on saying these kinds of things over and over again, right? So we're giving kids the tools to be able to think about a situation, break down the parts, and determine, wow, I'm feeling injured. Should I feel injured, or maybe this is just a coincidence, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking about, we call them microaggressions now. Microaggressions are all over the place. And there are a lot of kids, a lot of adults out there. Something might happen. You're just not sure how to call it. Reading it is giving people a vocabulary to use to be able to think a situation through. Naming it is making a determination. Okay, so was this accidental, coincidental, a situation that happened once, probably will never happen again? Or is this really something I should pay attention to? Is this racism? And I like to remind parents that for a child, calling something racist and really sitting with that can be an emotionally difficult moment, especially when kids are thinking about an incident that might have happened in school with an adult in school, like a teacher, principal, counselors. These are the people who are supposed to be caring for you, taking care of you, having your best interests at heart. And if they're doing something that you've determined is racist, that hurts. Mm-hmm. And we need to be able to understand that and be there for a child when they say, this teacher is racist and you need to, I'm going to share with you what they're doing, right? That is not the time to, forget it, belittle the child or suggest that the kid is thinking about this in ways that are wrong. It's really sitting with it and sitting with that pain, right? Naming it. Now, once you decide that this is racism, you're going to have to do something about it. And that moves into this third stage, opposing it. There are all sorts of different ways in which we can resist racism. Sometimes we resist racism in ways that are that may work in the short term, but in the long term, it could be problematic. So, for instance, the high school student or the middle school student who feels like a teacher is racist and decides to go and cuss the teacher out. I would consider that not a very smart resistance strategy, because there are power dynamics there, and that child could be expelled from school. We know that the suspension rates for black children is high and getting higher. Black kids are getting kicked out of school left and right for disciplinary reasons. So we don't want a child to become victimized by adopting a resistance strategy that might work in the short run. Ooh, I feel better now that I cussed her out. But in the long run, who's the one who's going to get hurt? So when we come up with those oppositional strategies, those resistance strategies with children, we have to make certain that they understand that they've got to come up with a strategy that is focused on the long term, a resistance strategy that has their best interests in mind, that is affirming of themselves, affirming of our culture, that is going to allow them to move forward and become the best that they can be. And sometimes that means, the kids that I've talked to have come up with strategies like you wouldn't believe. Sometimes strategies are going and talking to a teacher or talking to a principal in these kinds of situations. Sometimes it's about circulating a petition. Sometimes it's about writing something that goes into the school newspaper. I mean, there are so many different ways in which kids can resist positively and affirmatively. And we have to work with kids to develop those techniques. I remind black adolescents that the Me Too movement and Black Lives Matter were kitchen table movements, a group of people coming together saying, basically, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. And they created resistance strategies that turned into huge social movements, right? Okay. So helping kids to understand that there are ways that you can oppose and push back against the isms in your life that are really going to make a difference. That's opposing it. Understanding the history of resistance, helping kids to tap into that history and see themselves as members of a long legacy of resistors. And then the very last stage is replacing it. Because one thing we know is that these battles are hard won, and they take a tremendous amount out of us. Replacing it is about self-care. And I think we have to, in this culture, start early in helping kids to be able to figure out what it takes to take care of themselves. So, for some of us, for all of us, it's eating well, it's getting exercise, it's getting enough sleep, right? Mm-hmm. It's also knowing our history, reading about Black folks that have come before us, who have fought these battles and can, live to tell the tale. It's about nurturing our spirit. And I have Black teenagers who would talk about going to church or listening to gospel music and having those inspirational lyrics fill their hearts and fill their souls so that they could go back into that school the next day and do what they got to do to navigate that environment with their heads held up and with their eyes on the prize. So there are multiple ways in which we can recharge the battery. And we got to do it because the battle is long, right? And our children, are part of it, whether they like it or not.
Oh man, I think that's you broke it down so very well. And again, I think people, to learn more, they should definitely pick up the book, The Skin We're In, to get more details. And this has been a very enlightening and wonderful conversation, Dr. Ward.
Thank you. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you for listening. If you like this episode, subscribe to listen to other episodes. What is Black Podcast can be found on Stitcher, Google Play Music, and Apple Podcasts. Please remember to rate and review us.